March 5th, 2019. About 50 miles east of Los Angeles, in Hacienda Heights, a man arrived at an equestrian area near the Pico Rivera Sports Arena. It was a normal riding day. Open land, dust in the air, trails stretching into dry hills. The afternoon felt ordinary. Nothing urgent, nothing tense. Then he noticed a black duffel bag. It was placed aside the trail. Not hidden, not buried, just there, alone. It did not belong to the landscape. At first, he assumed someone forgot it. Riders sometimes leave equipment, but this bag looked different. Heavy, full, unnaturally rigid. He stepped closer, paused. Something felt wrong. He did not open it. He called authorities instead. Deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department arrived shortly after 3 p.m. They approached carefully, gloves on, measured movements. One deputy knelt beside the bag, unzipped it slowly. Inside was the body of a child, wrapped in clothing, still, small. For a moment, there was no identity, just a discovery. The scene shifted instantly. The quiet horse trails became a crime scene. Yellow tape, photographs, evidence markers pressed into dirt. Investigators scanned tire impressions nearby, recent tracks. A vehicle had stopped here, long enough to unload something, then left. No witnesses reported suspicious activity that morning, which meant the drop likely happened overnight. Someone drove here in the dark. Someone carried that bag. Someone left without hesitation. By evening, news helicopters circled overhead, but the child still had no name. No missing person alert had matched the description. That absence raised the first serious question. Why had no one reported her missing? March 6, 2019. The Los Angeles County coroner began identification procedures. Fingerprints were taken, DNA expedited. The body showed visible trauma, but officials withheld detail. The injuries were significant, not recent alone. Patterns suggested repetition. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, 9-year-old Trinity Love Jones had not been seen in days. She lived in a small apartment with her mother. Her mother was 28 years old, working unstable jobs, moving frequently in recent years. Financial stress was constant. Rent was often late. Utilities sometimes shut off. Stability was fragile. Living with them was Emil Lamar Hunt, 38, originally from Texas. He had recently become a permanent presence. Friends described him as quiet, controlled, disciplined. He believed in strict rules. Inside the apartment, dynamics had shifted over time. Neighbors later said arguments were common. Not screaming fights, low, tense exchanges, doors closing hard, thuds against walls. Trinity was described by classmates as shy, soft-spoken, sometimes withdrawn. School attendance became irregular in late February 2019. Excuses were vague. She's sick. She's staying home. No formal welfare check was triggered. On March 1, 2019, Trinity was last confirmed alive by someone outside the household. After that, no verified sightings, no school appearance, no doctor visit, no emergency call. Phone records would later show activity inside the apartment during critical hours, but no outgoing call for help. That silence now felt heavier, because on March 5th, while deputies stood over a duffel bag in Hacienda Heights, The people responsible for Trinity's care had not contacted police. They had not reported her missing. They had not asked for assistance. As the coroner worked through the night, identification became clearer. By March 7, 2019, authorities publicly confirmed the child found in the duffel bag was Trinity, 9 years old. The story changed immediately, because now this was no longer an unidentified tragedy. It was a child with a home, with guardians, with people who were supposed to protect her. And the timeline between March 1st and March 5th began to narrow. 4 days. 4 days of silence. 4 days where something irreversible happened, and no one outside that apartment knew. Pause. The question was no longer who she was. The question was what happened inside that home before the drive to Hacienda Heights.
March 7th, 2019. Authorities publicly identified the child found near the Pico Rivera Sports Arena as 9-year-old Trinity Love Jones. The reaction was immediate. Now there was a name, a school, an address. Detectives moved quickly. They went to the apartment in Los Angeles where Trinity lived with her mother and Emil Lamar Hunt. The knock came in the afternoon. No forced entry, no urgency, just procedure. Her mother answered the door. She appeared calm, too calm, some officers later noted. When asked about Trinity's whereabouts, she said the child was with relatives, out of town, safe. The statement was simple, clean, but detectives already knew the body had been identified. They watched her carefully. There was no visible shock, no collapse, no immediate confusion, just controlled breathing, measured words. Hunt was inside the apartment. He stepped forward when asked, relaxed posture, even tone. He said Trinity had been clumsy, prone to bruises. He described her as fragile. Investigators did not challenge him immediately. They listened, they documented, they observed. Because in cases like this, details matter later. Phone records were requested that same evening. Location data told a quiet story. On the night of March 4, both phones traveled east, away from Los Angeles, toward Hacienda Heights. The movement matched the window when the bag was likely placed. The route aligned with highway cameras. Traffic sensors confirmed a vehicle consistent with theirs. Dark sedan. Late night. Short stop. Return drive. That alignment was not coincidence. Back at the apartment, detectives began to notice small things. Fresh cleaning supplies under the sink. Strong chemical scent in the hallway. A mattress recently flipped. Carpet slightly damp in one corner. None of it dramatic alone. Together, it felt intentional. Neighbors were interviewed. One reported hearing loud thuds in late February. Another described arguments behind closed doors. Not screaming, more controlled than that, but tense, heavy. A third neighbor said they had not seen Trinity outside in weeks. That detail lingered. School records confirmed she had missed multiple days before March 1st. No medical note provided. No formal withdrawal filed. The pattern was forming. And patterns are difficult to dismiss. On March 8, search warrants were executed. The apartment was processed thoroughly. Walls photographed. Floorboards tested. Bedding collected. In the bathroom trash, investigators found blood-stained wipes, partially discarded, partially hidden. Luminol testing revealed faint patterns on the bedroom floor. Not chaotic splatter, localized impact points. Repeated. The medical examiner's preliminary findings were shared with detectives that same day. Blunt force trauma, internal injuries, healing fractures, older bruising beneath newer bruising. This was not a single event. It was layered, sustained. When confronted with the phone data, the mother adjusted her story. She admitted driving east that night, said they went for air, to clear their heads. She insisted Trinity was not with them. That claim collapsed quickly. Traffic footage showed two silhouettes inside the vehicle, one smaller, in the back seat. Hunt maintained composure during questioning. He denied abuse. He denied anger. He described discipline as necessary, structured. He used the word respect more than once. But evidence does not respond to tone. It responds to facts. By March 9th, detectives believed Trinity had died inside that apartment before the drive to Hacienda Heights, which meant there had been time. Time to call 911. Time to seek medical help. Time to choose differently. Instead, there was movement in the night. A vehicle heading east, a bag placed beside a trail, and silence. On March 10th, 2019, both were arrested, charged with murder and torture. The press conference was controlled, few details released, but one statement stood out. This was not sudden. That line carried weight, because sudden suggests loss of control. This suggested duration, escalation, a slow build behind closed doors.
But I just want justice for it. I want justice. I want answers.
The illusion from the outside had already begun to collapse. Now the fractures were visible, not emotional, structural. And the deeper investigators looked, the clearer the timeline became. 4 days between last sighting and discovery. But the violence may have started long before that. And the next question was unavoidable. How long had Trinity been living inside that silence?
She was our princess. She didn't deserve any of this. She didn't deserve to be tossed out like trash.
Before anyone finally looked closer. March 11th, 2019. Forensics intensified. The apartment in Los Angeles was processed again. Not quickly, thoroughly. Every surface documented. Every fiber collected. The duffel bag recovered near the Pico Rivera Sports Arena was examined under controlled light. Black nylon. Recently purchased. Receipts later confirmed it had been bought weeks earlier, not the day before. Weeks. That detail mattered. Inside the fabric, trace evidence remained. Carpet fibers consistent with the apartment bedroom. Microscopic debris. Household dust. The bag had not traveled far before March 5th. It belonged to that space. Autopsy results became official. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Severe internal bleeding. Multiple rib fractures. A lacerated liver. Some injuries fresh. Others partially healed. Healing fractures do not happen overnight. They require time. Which meant Trinity had been injured before. Repeatedly. Medical experts noted patterned trauma. Consistent impact zones. Not random, not accidental. There were no defensive wounds suggesting a fight. She had not fought back. Or could not. That distinction lingered. Investigators reconstructed the final 72 hours. Phone extractions revealed deleted messages between Emil Lamar Hunt and Trinity's mother. Arguments about discipline, about obedience, about control.
One message referenced taking it too far, sent late at night, then erased. But digital deletion is rarely permanent. Location data placed both devices inside the apartments during the estimated time of death. No emergency call was made, no search history for medical help, no attempt to seek assistance. Instead, hours later, there was movement. March 4th, shortly before midnight, the sedan left the apartment complex. Security cameras captured Hunt carrying a large object wrapped in dark material. He walked steadily, no visible panic, placed it in the trunk, closed it, returned upstairs briefly, then both phones moved east. Highway cameras confirmed the vehicle heading toward Hacienda Heights. Arrival window aligned with soil disturbance found near the trail. The stop lasted less than 10 minutes. Engine off, trunk opened, then closed again. The vehicle returned west. Routine resumed by morning. Groceries were purchased on March 5th. Phone calls made, no report filed. Financial records showed cleaning supplies bought the same week, heavy-duty trash bags, disinfectant, late-night purchase. Investigators used luminol again in the apartment bedroom, this time under complete darkness. The glow revealed impact stains beneath the carpet padding, repeated points of force, close to the wall, low to the ground. The pattern suggested a child's height. Medical testimony would later explain the fatal sequence: a severe beating, blunt impact to the torso, internal bleeding progressing over time, not instant death. There was a window where intervention was possible. Minutes, possibly longer, but no call was made. That silence became central to the prosecution's theory. Because accidents trigger panic, this triggered transport, containment, concealment. During interrogation, Hunt maintained the same tone, measured, disciplined. He denied striking her fatally. He suggested she fell, more than once. Investigators compared his statement to the injury pattern. The physics did not align. Multiple rib fractures require force, repetition, consistency. The mother's statements continued to shift. At one point, she admitted hearing a thud. Said she thought Trinity was being punished. Said she did not intervene. That admission altered everything, because knowledge changes responsibility. By March 15th, prosecutors believed the evidence showed prolonged abuse culminating in homicide, not a momentary loss of control, a pattern layered over weeks, perhaps longer. The case file grew thicker. Photos, forensic charts, phone extraction reports, autopsy diagrams, each document narrowing possibility, each detail removing doubt. The evidence was no longer circumstantial, it was structural, built piece by piece, and when assembled, it formed a single conclusion. Trinity did not die suddenly. She died in a space where help was possible, and never called. The question now was not what happened. The evidence had answered that. The question was how long it had been building before anyone outside that apartment saw the signs. March 20, 2019. Formal charges were filed. Murder, torture, child abuse resulting in death. The case against Emil Lamar Hunt and Tequesta Graham was now public. Detectives walked prosecutors through every detail. Each forensic report, each phone ping, each neighbor interview. The timeline was methodical. March 1st, Trinity last seen outside the apartment. March 4th, movement east toward Hacienda Heights. March 5th, body found in duffel bag near Pico Rivera Sports Arena. Defense attorneys offered alternate explanations. Accidental injury,
misunderstood discipline. But evidence contradicted every narrative. Forensic patterns showed repeated trauma, some injuries fresh, some healing. No single event could explain the full picture. Deleted texts were recovered. Location data confirmed both phones traveled east that night. Security footage showed a dark sedan arriving near the trail. Neighbors spoke of vague disturbances in late February. Not screams, just tension. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented the facts. Slowly, deliberately. No hyperbole, just reality. Medical experts explained the severity of injuries. Blunt force trauma, internal bleeding, fractures at different stages of healing. Photos of evidence were shown. The duffel bag, soil samples matching the apartment, the route recorded on highway cameras. When it came time for testimony, Tequesta Graham took the stand. Her statements shifted with questioning.
She acknowledged normal discipline. She acknowledged tension in the home, but she denied knowing how serious the injuries were. She said she believed Hunt was helping. She said she trusted his care. The jury watched closely. No tears, no dramatic moments, just measured testimony. Defense attorneys attempted to redirect responsibility. Accidents are unpredictable, they argued. No intent, they suggested. Prosecutors countered with science. Injury patterns do not lie. By April, the trial was fully underway. Media coverage was restrained. Reporters focused on court proceedings, not headlines. Inside the courtroom, voices were calm, controlled, serious. Cross-examinations highlighted inconsistencies. Phone records juxtaposed with statements. Forensic charts explained injury timing. Days passed slowly. By May, the jury reached decisions. Guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment for Hunt. A lesser sentence for Tequesta Graham due to her cooperation and partial admissions. Outside the courthouse, family members gathered quietly. No chants, no spectacle, just silence with subdued grief. Neighbors reflected on the tragedy, how quiet the signs had been, how easily routine obscured harm. Trinity's case did not become tabloid drama. It became a legal reconstruction of how a child's pain went unnoticed. The timeline was complete, each interaction accounted for, each omission explained. Justice, in its slow, measured form, had been served. And still there was an echo, a question that remained after verdicts and sentences. How many more stories begin with silence before anyone finally listens? May 2019. The trial concluded. Sentences were served. But the story did not end. The neighborhood carried a quiet weight. Hacienda Heights, Los Angeles County. Residents reflected on signs they missed. The slow accumulation of abuse. The silence in routine. Local schools implemented stricter monitoring. Counselors spoke about early intervention. Trinity's classmates remembered her softly. Teachers recalled small changes. The quiet withdrawal. Long sleeves on warm days. Her name became a symbol, a reminder that small signs matter. Emil Lamar Hunt was removed from society, life imprisonment. Tequesta Graham received a reduced sentence. Her cooperation contributed to clarity in court. Families followed the case closely. They learned what careful observation could reveal. Media coverage shifted after the trial, from initial shock to reflection, from sensational headlines to systemic analysis. The duffel bag, once a symbol of tragedy, became a teaching point for law enforcement, for social workers, for parents.
The case prompted discussions about trust, control, and accountability, how authority can be misused, how silence can hide patterns, how intervention can save lives. In homes across the county, conversations changed. Discipline was reevaluated. Signs of distress were not ignored. Trinity's life, brief and tragic, left a lasting imprint. It was not about spectacle, not about horror. It was about awareness, awareness of cumulative harm, awareness of repeated silence, awareness that prevention requires attention. The legal system reconstructed her final days, measured, precise, factual. Justice was served, but the aftershock remained. Communities carried the weight. Families remembered. Teachers observed more closely. And somewhere, quietly, the lessons of Trinity Love Jones continue. In your opinion, how many silent witnesses does it take before tragedy happens?
August 19, 2017, Fargo, North Dakota. It was the kind of evening that feels unfinished. The air was still warm, but summer was already starting to loosen its grip. Inside a modest apartment building, life moved quietly. Doors opening, footsteps on stairs, televisions murmuring behind thin walls. 22-year-old Savanna LaFontaine-Greywind was 8 months pregnant. She was not hiding. She was not afraid. She was preparing. Her family described her as soft-spoken but strong. She was excited. The baby's clothes were ready. The crib was assembled. There were plans for the future. Ordinary, beautiful plans that revolve around a new life entering the world. She lived upstairs with her parents. Below her lived a couple, Brooke Cruz and William Hone. Neighbors, nothing more. At least that's what everyone believed. That evening, Brooke asked Savanna for a small favor. She needed help sewing a dress. It was simple, casual, harmless. Savanna told her mother she was going downstairs for just a few minutes. Those were the last words her family heard before everything changed. Minutes passed, then an hour. Her phone stopped responding. There were no screams, no sounds of struggle, no broken furniture, no sign of forced entry. Because Savanna hadn't been taken from the outside, she had walked into the danger herself. At first, it didn't look like a crime. People disappear for reasons that are mundane. Arguments, stress, fear of responsibility. Maybe she left. Maybe she needed space. But something didn't fit. Savanna was 8 months pregnant. She wasn't the type to vanish. She had no history of running away, no unresolved conflict, no signs of instability. And then there was something else. Brooke Cruz had been telling people she was pregnant too. For months, she had shown pictures, posted updates, talked about doctor's visits, shared ultrasound images. But no one had ever seen her with a visibly pregnant body. No hospital records confirmed her pregnancy.
No doctor could verify her claims. Yet suddenly, just days after Savanna disappeared, Brooke announced she had given birth, at home, privately, to a healthy baby girl. No hospital, no witnesses, no paperwork, just a newborn in the apartment downstairs. And upstairs, a missing woman who should have been days away from delivering her own child. When police began knocking on doors, Brooke appeared calm. William stood beside her. They said they hadn't seen Savanna that night. They said she never came down. They said they didn't know anything. But something in the timeline felt wrong. Savanna was last seen entering their apartment, and she never came out. The building was small, quiet, intimate. Sound traveled through the walls. It is difficult to imagine something violent happening in that space without someone hearing it. Unless it was planned. Unless it was controlled. Unless the person responsible had already imagined every step. As the hours turned into days, tension thickened. Savanna's family refused to believe she had left willingly. They searched. They pleaded. They organized vigils. Meanwhile, downstairs, a newborn slept in a crib. A newborn that, according to Brooke, had been inside her body just days earlier. But doctors would later confirm something chilling. Brooke had not recently given birth, which raised a single terrifying question. If the baby wasn't hers, then where did she come from? The most disturbing part of this case is not just the violence that followed. It is proximity. Savanna did not meet a stranger in a dark parking lot. She did not accept a ride from an unknown predator. She walked down a familiar staircase, to a neighbor, to someone who smiled at her in the hallway, to someone who knew she was pregnant, to someone who wanted what she had. And sometimes, the most dangerous place is not far away. Sometimes, it is one floor below you. Before Savanna disappeared, Brooke Cruz had already built a story. Not in one day, not in one lie, over months. She told friends she was pregnant. She told family she was expecting. She shared ultrasound images. She described doctor's visits. She spoke about cravings, back pain, fatigue. The performance was consistent, but there was something unusual. No one could clearly remember seeing her physically pregnant. There were no baby showers organized by close friends. No photos that showed a growing stomach month by month. No hospital bracelets. No public appointments. Only words. And words, when repeated long enough, begin to feel real. Psychologists sometimes describe a phenomenon where a person becomes trapped inside their own fabrication. A lie told to impress. A lie told to hold on to someone. A lie told to avoid shame. And then the lie grows teeth. Brooke's relationship with William Hone was unstable. There were arguments, there were breakups, there were reconciliations. A pregnancy can change dynamics. A pregnancy can create permanence. A pregnancy can prevent someone from leaving. At least that may have been the belief. Friends later said Brooke had claimed previous miscarriages. Each time, the story ended in tragedy. Each time, sympathy followed. Each time, attention was restored. But this time, she went further. She allowed the pregnancy narrative to reach its final stage. The due date was approaching. People expected a baby. And expectations can be dangerous when built on fiction. On August 19, when Savanna walked downstairs, Brooke was facing a deadline. The illusion was about to collapse. There are moments in criminal psychology where pressure meets fantasy and something fractures. Because when reality threatens exposure, some individuals do not confess, they escalate. After Savanna vanished, Brooke posted nothing publicly for a short period. Then came the announcement. She had given birth, at home, privately. She described labor. She described pain. She described holding the baby for the first time. Her voice was calm. But medically, something was impossible. Women who give birth experience physiological signs, hormonal changes, physical trauma, postpartum recovery. When authorities later examined Brooke, doctors concluded she had not recently delivered a child. The body does not lie, even when the mind does. Meanwhile, William Hone remained beside her. His role remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Did he know the pregnancy was fake? Did he believe her? Did he suspect something was wrong when a newborn appeared without a hospital visit? Or did he choose not to ask questions?
Silence can be complicity, or it can be denial, and sometimes it is fear. Inside the apartment, investigators would later discover signs of cleaning, carpet that had been treated, furniture rearranged, bleach, attempts to erase something that had already happened. But erasing physical traces does not erase timelines. Savanna had entered that apartment alive, and the next time anyone saw her, she would be found in a river. There is something uniquely disturbing about crimes driven by identity theft of motherhood. This was not random violence. This was targeted. Savanna was visibly pregnant. She represented something Brooke could not biologically produce at that moment, but desperately wanted others to believe she had. And when fantasy collided with another woman's reality, only one could remain. The illusion demanded a sacrifice. When police questioned Brooke again, inconsistencies multiplied. Details shifted, timelines blurred, explanations contradicted earlier statements. The story no longer held together. And pressure changes people. Under scrutiny, cracks appear. Under scrutiny, illusions collapse. And beneath the illusion, something far darker was waiting. On August 27, 2017, 8 days after Savanna disappeared, the Red River moved slowly under a gray North Dakota sky. Kayakers were passing through a quiet stretch of water. What they saw at first did not look human. It was wrapped in plastic, partially submerged, heavy. When authorities arrived and pulled it from the water, the shape became unmistakable. It was Savanna LaFontaine-Greywind. She had been weighted down, bound, discarded. The river did not hide her forever. It never does. The autopsy confirmed what investigators already feared. Savanna had been strangled, but that was not the detail that would define this case. There was a large incision across her abdomen. Her baby had been removed. This was not an accident. This was not panic. This was surgical in intention, even if not in skill. The act required time, control, proximity. It required someone who was not afraid to cross a line that most human beings would never even approach in imagination. Fetal abduction cases are rare. When they occur, they follow a disturbing pattern. The perpetrator often pretends to be pregnant, builds a narrative, creates anticipation, and when the lie approaches exposure, violence replaces confession. Investigators now understood what they were looking at. Savanna had not been kidnapped for ransom. She had not been attacked randomly. She had been selected. Because she was pregnant. Because she lived upstairs. Because she trusted the wrong door. Back at the apartment building, police presence intensified. Brooke Cruz still claimed she had delivered her baby at home, but now there was a body in the river, and there was a newborn in her apartment. DNA testing was no longer optional. It was immediate. The infant girl was taken into protective custody. Within hours, the results would confirm what everyone feared and hoped at the same time. The baby was Savanna's. She was alive.
The brutality of the act collided with something almost impossible. The child had survived. Despite being removed from her mother's body under violent circumstances, despite the absence of medical supervision at birth, despite everything, she was breathing, crying, alive. It is difficult to reconcile those two realities at once. A mother murdered, a baby saved. When confronted with the discovery of Savanna's body, Brooke's composure shifted. Small inconsistencies became fractures. Statements no longer aligned, and investigators began reconstructing the final moments inside that apartment. Savanna had gone downstairs willingly. There were no signs she expected violence. At some point, she was overpowered, strangled. The act of removing the baby came after, which means this was not about killing first. It was about taking.
The homicide ensured silence. The true objective was the child. William Hone's position became increasingly complicated. Phone records, movements, statements. Did he return home while Savanna's body was still inside? Did he see blood? Did he assist in disposal? Or did he look at the newborn and choose not to question how she arrived? In criminal investigations, omission can be as revealing as action. The river forced truth into daylight. It turned suspicion into evidence. And once evidence speaks, narratives collapse. Brooke Cruz was arrested. William Hone was arrested. The illusion was over. What remained was something far darker than a lie. It was premeditated violence built on obsession. And at its center, a single unbearable fact. Savanna had trusted her neighbor. Interrogation rooms are designed for one purpose: silence. Neutral walls, a metal table, fluorescent light that never softens. When Brooke Cruz sat down across from investigators, the illusion was already fractured, but she was still trying to hold it together. At first, her voice was steady. She repeated the same story. She had been birthed at home.
They're working with the people that they need to get the proper red tape cleared and things like that.
Alone, unexpectedly. She panicked, but everything turned out fine. She insisted the baby was hers, even after being told that Savanna's body had been recovered from the river, even after being informed that DNA testing was underway. Denial can be powerful, especially when a lie has been rehearsed for months. Investigators did not rush. They let silence do the work. They asked small questions. When did labor begin? How long did it last? Where's the placenta? Why was there no medical follow-up? Why did neighbors not hear anything? Details matter, and fabricated stories collapse under detail. Her timeline shifted. Minutes became hours. Certainty became, I think. Confidence became hesitation. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the apartment was being processed. Blood traces had been cleaned, but not erased. Chemical luminol reacts with iron in blood, even after attempts to wash it away. Patterns began to appear. On the floor, on fabric, in places inconsistent with childbirth. This was not a delivery scene. It was a struggle scene. William Hone was questioned separately. His responses were less emotional, more distant. He claimed he did not know the pregnancy was fake. He claimed he believed Brooke. He claimed he came home to find a baby already there. But investigators confronted him with timing inconsistencies, phone data, text messages, movements in and out of the apartment. It became increasingly difficult to maintain ignorance as a defense, because even if he had not committed the physical act, the aftermath required participation. A body had to be moved. A narrative had to be supported. Silence had to be chosen. Eventually, Brooke's resistance weakened. The weight of evidence is not loud. It accumulates,
and then it becomes inescapable. She admitted that Savanna had come downstairs. She admitted there was an argument. She admitted she strangled her. But the most disturbing admission came next. She had cut the baby from Savanna's body. Not in panic, not accidentally, but intentionally. Because she wanted the child. Because she had promised a baby. Because the lie had reached its deadline. There is something chilling about motive that is not rooted in rage, not revenge, not jealousy, but entitlement. Brooke did not express hatred towards Savanna. She expressed desire. Desire to be seen as a mother. Desire to present a newborn to the world. And when reality refused to cooperate, she reshaped it through violence. Prosecutors would later argue premeditation. She invited Savanna downstairs. She isolated her. She prepared. She cleaned afterward. She attempted to dispose of the body in the river. Each step required decision-making. Each step required continuation. At any moment, she could have stopped. She did not. William Hone maintained that he was not present during the killing. However, he admitted to helping dispose of the body. He admitted to lying to investigators initially, which shifted his role from ignorance to participation. In criminal law, presence is not always required for guilt. Assistance after the fact can carry its own weight. When charges were formally filed, the case became national news. A pregnant woman murdered, a baby cut from her womb, a neighbor responsible. The brutality was undeniable, but so was the survival of the child, and that survival would shape the courtroom. Brooke Cruz eventually pleaded guilty to murder and kidnapping. William Hone was convicted for his role in the crime and concealment. Sentences followed. Decades in prison, time measured in years that will never return what was taken. Interrogation rooms reveal something fundamental. When the illusion ends, what remains is choice. And in this case, every critical moment was a choice. To lie, to escalate, to harm, to conceal. The fantasy of motherhood had required a body, and Savanna paid the price.
Courtrooms are different from interrogation rooms. They are not built for confession. They are built for judgment. By the time the case of Savanna LaFontaine-Greywind reached court in 2018, the country already knew the outline of the crime. But court is not about headlines. It is about evidence and consequences. Brooke Cruz chose not to take the case to trial. Instead, she entered a guilty plea. She admitted to intentional murder. She admitted to conspiracy. She admitted to cutting Savanna's baby from her body. There was no dramatic courtroom cross-examination, no surprise witness, no jury deliberation. Just a formal acknowledgement of horror. But guilty pleas do not erase impact. They only accelerate sentencing. In February 2018, the judge handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No future appeals for early release. No second chance. In North Dakota, that is the maximum penalty short of capital punishment. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. Savanna's family was there. They did not celebrate. There is no victory in this kind of justice. Only finality. William Hone chose a different path. He went to trial. Prosecutors argued he participated in disposing of Savanna's body. They argued he knew the truth. They argued that even if he did not commit the killing, he helped protect it. The defense claimed he was manipulated, that he was shocked, that he did not fully understand what had happened. The jury deliberated.
And they convicted him of conspiracy to commit murder and providing false information. He was sentenced to life in prison. 2 people, 2 life sentences, 1 irreversible act. But the legal story did not end there. In 2019, the North Dakota Supreme Court overturned William Hone's murder conspiracy conviction, ruling there was insufficient evidence that he planned the killing in advance. He later accepted a plea agreement for aiding an offender. His sentence was reduced. Still prison, still consequences, but not life. The law narrowed its focus. It distinguished between participation in murder and assistance after. For Savanna's family, that legal nuance did not change loss. At the center of everything was the child. The baby girl survived. She was placed in the care of Savanna's family. She grew up knowing her mother's name, knowing her story, knowing that her life began in violence, but continued in love. Her survival changed the narrative. Without her, this would be only a story about brutality. With her, it became something else. Proof that even inside the darkest crimes, life can persist. Savanna LaFontaine-Greywind was 22 years old, 8 months pregnant, living above the people who would kill her. Her trust was ordinary. Her mistake was human. The cruelty she encountered was not. The story ended with a verdict, but the memory did not. What do you think is the most chilling part of this case?
Thanksgiving morning arrived quietly in Colorado. The mountains were already covered in snow. The air was cold. The town of Woodland Park was calm. Nothing felt unusual. Inside a small home, a young mother was preparing for the day. Her name was Kelsey Berreth. She was 29 years old, a flight instructor, calm, responsible, focused. Flying had always been her passion. Friends described her as organized and careful, the kind of person who planned everything. Her life looked stable. She had a job she loved. She had a young daughter, and she had a fiancé. His name was Patrick Frazee. From the outside, their relationship looked normal. They had met years earlier through a dating website. Patrick was a rancher in rural Colorado, quiet, reserved, hard to read. Still, the relationship moved forward. They became engaged. Soon after, their daughter was born, a little girl named Kaylee. Friends believed Kelsey was building the life she wanted, a home, a family, a future. But relationships are rarely as simple as they appear. Some people close to Kelsey noticed distance between the couple. Patrick rarely visited. He lived on his ranch in Florissant. Kelsey lived in Woodland Park, just a short drive apart, yet they often seemed separated by something larger. Patrick preferred isolation. Kelsey preferred structure and routine. Still, nothing suggested danger. Not yet. On Thanksgiving morning in 2018, Kelsey made a few short trips around town. Security cameras later confirmed it. She visited a grocery store. She stopped at a coffee shop. Employees remembered her holding her daughter. Everything looked normal, just a mother running errands. Later that morning, Kelsey returned home. At some point that day, Patrick Frazee arrived. Investigators would later determine he came to the house carrying a baseball bat. But on that morning, nobody knew that. Neighbors did not hear anything unusual. No screaming, no signs of struggle, no calls for help. Only silence. And silence can hide many things. That same day, Patrick left the house with the child. Kaylee was safe, but Kelsey was gone. At first, nothing seemed strange. People disappear for short periods all the time. Phones die, plans change, life gets busy. But small details began to feel wrong. Kelsey did not contact her mother. That alone was unusual. Her mother, Cheryl Berreth, spoke with her daughter often, sometimes every day. Then something even stranger happened. Text messages suddenly appeared on Kelsey's phone. Messages sent to friends, messages sent to family. They claimed she was leaving town, starting a new life. But the tone felt different. Cold, short, mechanical. Not like Kelsey. Her co-workers also noticed something odd. She missed work. For a flight instructor, that almost never happened. No call, no explanation. Her employer became concerned.
Days passed. Then more days. Still no confirmed sightings. And that was when the questions began. Where was Kelsey Berreth? Why would a devoted mother disappear without warning? Why would she abandon her job? And who was sending those strange messages? At first, Patrick Frazee appeared calm. He told people Kelsey was fine. He suggested she might have gone somewhere, maybe Idaho, maybe visiting family, maybe starting over. His explanations shifted, small changes in the story, tiny inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, but something about it felt wrong. Investigators would later say the same thing. Something about this disappearance didn't fit. Because people can disappear, but their patterns rarely disappear with them. And Kelsey Berreth was a woman of patterns, schedules, plans, routine. Then investigators discovered something disturbing. Kelsey had not used her phone. Her bank accounts were untouched. Her car never moved. Her home looked abandoned, almost as if she had simply vanished. But that wasn't the most disturbing part, because behind the quiet ranch life of Patrick Frazee, someone else was about to enter the story. And when she finally spoke to investigators, everything changed.
For several days, the town waited. People believed Kelsey would return. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she went somewhere quietly. Maybe there was an explanation. But the silence kept growing. On November 25th, Kelsey's employer made a decision. They called the police. A missing person report was filed in Woodland Park. At first, the case looked simple. An adult woman missing. No obvious signs of violence. No confirmed witnesses. But investigators started with the basics. Phone records, bank activity, security cameras. Very quickly, a pattern appeared. Or, more accurately, the absence of one. Kelsey's life had stopped moving. Her phone stopped traveling. Her credit cards were never used. Her car stayed parked. Everything simply froze on Thanksgiving Day, November 22, 2018. That alone worried investigators, because people who leave voluntarily still move through the world. They buy food, they use gas stations, they withdraw money. But Kelsey Berreth did none of those things, not once. Then detectives began interviewing the people closest to her. Friends, co-workers, family members. Everyone told the same story. Kelsey loved routine. She loved her daughter. She would never disappear without telling someone, especially her mother, especially not on Thanksgiving. Investigators also wanted to speak with the fiancé.
Is there anything else that you remember?
I moved to the couch. I wiped the couch off. There was blood behind the couch down the wall.
Patrick Frazee. Patrick did speak with police, but something about the conversation felt strange. He appeared calm, almost too calm. He told detectives that Kelsey had asked him to pick up their daughter that day. He claimed she wanted some time alone. Then he said something else, something unexpected. He told police that Kelsey might have left for Idaho. According to him, she wanted to start a new life, a fresh start, without him, without anyone. It sounded possible, but the story had problems. Detectives asked simple questions. When did she say that? What exactly did she say? Did she pack anything? Patrick's answers were vague, sometimes unclear, and sometimes different. Then investigators learned another detail. Patrick had never reported Kelsey missing, not once, even though he had their daughter, even though days had passed, even though no one could reach her. That detail stayed with investigators, because most people would call the police, especially if the mother of their child vanished. But Patrick Frazee did not. Instead, he continued working on his ranch in Florissant, feeding animals, fixing equipment, living normally, almost as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the search for Kelsey intensified. Police searched her home. The house looked mostly normal, but something small stood out. Cleaning supplies, lots of them. The smell of chemicals lingered in certain areas. It was subtle, but noticeable. Then detectives found something else. Kelsey's phone had sent text messages after Thanksgiving. Messages claiming she was safe. Messages telling people not to worry. But investigators studied the messages carefully. The wording felt wrong. The tone felt cold. Short responses, unusual phrases. Friends said the same thing. It didn't sound like her. Investigators also tracked the phone itself. The signal moved, but not very far. It traveled between Woodland Park and Florissant, two places connected to one person, Patrick Frazee. Then detectives discovered something even more concerning. Some of the messages were sent days after Kelsey disappeared, but the phone activity matched Patrick's movements almost exactly. It raised a disturbing possibility. Someone else might have been using her phone. But investigators still lacked proof. No body, no witnesses, no confession. Just a growing list of inconsistencies. And then another strange detail appeared. Patrick mentioned someone during the investigation, a woman from another state.
Her name was Crystal Lee Kenny. Patrick described her casually, just a friend, someone he knew from Idaho. At the time, it didn't seem important, but detectives noted the name. Because investigations often turn on small details, and this was one of them. Meanwhile, Kelsey's family refused to believe she left voluntarily. Her mother, Cheryl Berreth, flew to Colorado. She wanted answers. She began speaking publicly, pleading for information, hoping someone had seen something. The case started gaining media attention. News stations covered the disappearance. Posters appeared across Colorado. The question spread quickly. Where was Kelsey Berreth? Police continued gathering evidence quietly. Phone data, travel records, digital timelines. Slowly, a picture began forming. And it pointed back to the same person again and again. Patrick Frazee. But investigators still needed something stronger. Something that could break the case open. Because suspicion alone is not enough. Then, detectives made a decision. They contacted the woman from Idaho, Crystal Lee Kenny. At first, it seemed like a routine interview. Just another person connected to Patrick. But what she eventually told investigators would change the entire investigation.
Detectives expected a routine interview. Just another person connected to Patrick Frazee, someone who might know small details, nothing more. The woman's name was Crystal Lee Kenny. She lived in Idaho, several hours away from Woodland Park. At first, the conversation felt normal. Crystal spoke carefully. She answered questions slowly. Sometimes she paused before speaking. Investigators noticed something. She seemed nervous, not defensive, just uneasy. Detectives began with simple questions. How did she know Patrick? How long had they been in contact? Crystal admitted something important. She was not just a friend. She was his girlfriend. At the same time, Patrick was engaged to Kelsey Berreth. That detail immediately changed the tone of the interview. Now, detectives had a motive, a hidden relationship. But that was only the beginning. Then Crystal said something that stunned investigators. Patrick had talked about killing Kelsey, not once, 3 different times. The first conversation happened months before Thanksgiving. Patrick asked Crystal a strange question. Would she help him kill Kelsey? Crystal believed he was choking. She laughed it off. She told him no. But the conversation returned again and again. Each time, Patrick sounded more serious. He described possible plans.
Ways to make it look like an accident. Ways to make it look like self-defense. Crystal claimed she always refused. But she never reported those conversations. Detectives asked why. Crystal struggled to explain. Fear, confusion, loyalty. Maybe all 3. Then investigators asked the most important question. What happened on Thanksgiving? Crystal took a long breath. And then she told them. Patrick called her that evening. His voice sounded calm. Too calm. He told her something shocking. Kelsey is gone. At first, Crystal thought he meant she had left, but Patrick clarified. He said he had killed her. Inside her own home in Woodland Park. Investigators listened carefully. Crystal described what Patrick told her. He said he brought a baseball bat to the house. He waited for Kelsey inside. When she walked into the room, he attacked. Crystal said Patrick claimed Kelsey fought back. She tried to defend herself, but the attack continued. Eventually, she stopped moving. Patrick told Crystal the scene was messy. There was blood. A lot of it. So he began cleaning for hours, using cleaning supplies. Bleach,
trash bags, anything he could find. Then he made another decision. He needed help. Not with the murder, but with what came after. Patrick asked Crystal to come to Colorado. He told her to clean the house again, to remove any remaining evidence. Crystal agreed. That decision would change everything. A few days later, she drove from Idaho to Colorado. She arrived at Patrick's ranch in Florissant. Patrick gave her instructions. Clean Kelsey's home, wipe everything, burn anything suspicious. Crystal said she followed those instructions. She entered the house. The smell hit her immediately. Strong chemicals, bleach everywhere. The floors had been scrubbed, but some stains remained. Crystal said she cleaned for hours, wiping walls, scrubbing floors, removing trash bags. Then Patrick told her to burn the evidence: clothes, cleaning supplies, trash. They burned everything in a metal container on the ranch, smoke rising into the cold Colorado air. Investigators listening to Crystal's story understood something important. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a murder investigation. But one question remained. Where was Kelsey's body? Detectives asked Crystal that directly. Her answer was chilling. Patrick never told her. She never saw the body. Trash bags, anything he could find. Then he made another decision. He needed help. Not with the murder, but with what came after. Patrick asked Crystal to come to Colorado. He told her to clean the house again, to remove any remaining evidence. Crystal agreed. That decision would change everything. A few days later, she drove from Idaho to Colorado. She arrived at Patrick's ranch in Florissant. Patrick gave her instructions. Clean Kelsey's home, wipe everything, burn anything suspicious. Crystal said she followed those instructions. She entered the house. The smell hit her immediately. Strong chemicals, bleach everywhere. The floors had been scrubbed, but some stains remained. Crystal said she cleaned for hours, wiping walls, scrubbing floors, removing trash bags. Then Patrick told her to burn the evidence: clothes, cleaning supplies, trash. They burned everything in a metal container on the ranch, smoke rising into the cold Colorado air. Investigators listening to Crystal's story understood something important. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a murder investigation. But one question remained. Where was Kelsey's body? Detectives asked Crystal that directly. Her answer was chilling. Patrick never told her. She never saw the body.
By late December, investigators believed they understood what happened. Not every detail, not every movement, but the outline was becoming clear. The story of Kelsey Berreth was no longer a mystery of disappearance. It was a planned killing. And the person at the center of that story was still living freely. Patrick Frazee continued working on his ranch in Florissant, feeding cattle, repairing fences, caring for his daughter. But investigators were quietly rebuilding the timeline, piece by piece, hour by hour. They began with Thanksgiving morning, November 22, 2018. Security cameras confirmed that Kelsey returned to her home in Woodland Park that morning. She carried groceries. She carried her daughter. She walked through the front door. That was the last confirmed moment she was seen alive. Sometime later that morning, Patrick Frazee arrived. According to the testimony of Crystal Lee Kenny, he came prepared. He brought a baseball bat. Investigators believe he entered the home quietly, possibly while Kelsey was in another room. He waited. Minutes passed. Then Kelsey walked into the room. What happened next lasted only moments. Patrick attacked. The first blow came quickly, unexpected. Investigators believe Kelsey fought back. There were signs of movement inside the house, objects slightly displaced, small traces that survived the cleaning. But the attack continued, again and again. Eventually, the house fell silent. Afterward, Patrick faced a problem.
The scene was chaotic. Blood, damage, evidence everywhere. So he started cleaning. For hours. Bleach, cleaning sprays, paper towels, trash bags. Investigators later discovered that many surfaces had been scrubbed repeatedly, almost obsessively. But complete erasure is nearly impossible. Tiny traces remained, hidden inside cracks, inside floor seams, inside microscopic fibers. Those details would later matter in court. After the cleaning, Patrick needed to remove the body. But investigators still do not know exactly how he did it. No confirmed location has ever been found. What detectives believe is this: Patrick transported the body somewhere in rural Colorado, an area with miles of open land, remote roads, deep terrain, places where something could disappear, maybe forever. Later that same day, Patrick drove back to Florissant with his daughter. From the outside, his life continued normally, but the digital evidence told another story. Phone data, vehicle movements, text messages. Investigators discovered that Patrick had Kelsey's phone, using it, sending messages, trying to create the illusion that she was still alive.
Messages were sent to coworkers, to family members, even to Kelsey's employer. Each message served the same purpose: delay, confusion, time. Time to clean, time to hide evidence, time to control the story. But the digital timeline betrayed him. Every signal from the phone matched Patrick's movements, not Kelsey's. Then investigators discovered something else. Patrick attempted to sell Kelsey's phone. He asked someone to reset it, to erase everything. Fortunately, that never fully happened. Much of the data survived. Meanwhile, detectives were preparing the final step: an arrest. But arrests require precision. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence carefully: Crystal's testimony, digital records, forensic traces, witness statements. Together, the picture was strong enough. On December 21, 2018, law enforcement moved in. Officers arrived at Patrick's ranch in Florissant. The moment was quiet. No dramatic chase, no resistance. Patrick Frazee was arrested without incident. He was charged with murder. As officers placed him into custody, the story he told the world finally collapsed. But even then, Patrick maintained his innocence. He said Kelsey had attacked him. He claimed self-defense.
A version of events that investigators had already examined and rejected. The case would now move to court, where the entire story would be told publicly for the first time. The planning, the attack, the cleanup, the lies, and the testimony of the one person who knew the plan before it happened: Crystal Lee Kenny. For the Berreth family, the arrest brought a small measure of relief. But one painful truth remained: Kelsey's body had never been found. And without that final answer, some questions would never disappear. The trial began in the fall of 2019. The courtroom was quiet, but the case had already drawn national attention. A young mother was gone. Her body had never been found, and the man accused of killing her was sitting just a few feet away. Patrick Frazee sat at the defense table, calm, still, almost expressionless. Across the room sat the family of Kelsey Berreth. They had waited nearly a year for this moment, a year of questions, a year of silence. Now the story would finally be told in full. Prosecutors began carefully. They did not start with emotion. They started with the timeline. November 22, 2018, Thanksgiving morning. Security footage, phone data, witnesses. Step by step, the jury began to see the pattern. Kelsey's final movements, Patrick's arrival, the sudden stop in her digital activity. Then the text messages that followed, messages that investigators now believed Patrick had written. The prosecution argued that those messages were not communication. They were misdirection, an attempt to delay discovery, an attempt to buy time. Then the courtroom heard from one of the most important witnesses in the case, Crystal Lee Kenny. She walked to the stand slowly. The room was silent. For hours, she described the conversations she had with Patrick, the plans, the 3 times he asked her to help kill Kelsey. Each story added another layer, another piece of the puzzle. She told the jury about the phone call on Thanksgiving night, the moment Patrick told her the murder had already happened. She described the cleaning, the bleach, the trash bags, the burning of evidence on the ranch in Florissant. The defense attacked her credibility immediately. They argued that Crystal was lying to save herself. They reminded the jury that she had accepted a plea deal, evidence tampering, 3 years in prison, in exchange for her testimony. But prosecutors had more than her words. They had digital evidence, phone records, location data, messages sent from Kelsey's phone. Each one aligned with Patrick's movements, not Kelsey's. Investigators also presented forensic evidence from the home in Woodland Park. Despite heavy cleaning, traces of blood had survived, hidden in areas most people never think about, inside floor seams, behind appliances, microscopic fragments that could not be erased. The prosecution argued that those traces told a clear story. A violent attack had occurred in that house, and it had been carefully cleaned afterward. Then the defense presented their case. Patrick Frazee did not testify. Instead, his attorneys offered a different version of events. They suggested Kelsey had attacked Patrick. They claimed he acted in self-defense. And they argued that Crystal Lee Kenny was the real killer. According to their theory, she was the one responsible, and Patrick was being blamed for her actions.
It was a dramatic claim, but the evidence did not support it. Phone data contradicted the story. Witness timelines contradicted the story. Even Crystal's travel records contradicted it. Slowly, the defense narrative began to collapse. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt heavy. Prosecutors spoke about deception, about planning, about a man who wanted two lives, a fiancé in Colorado and a girlfriend in Idaho. And when those lives collided, he chose violence. The defense asked the jury to consider doubt, to consider the missing body, because without a body, certainty becomes harder. The jury listened. They studied the evidence. Then they left the courtroom to deliberate. Hours passed, then more hours. Finally, the jury returned. The room fell silent. Patrick Frazee stood as the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of tampering with evidence. Guilty of solicitation to commit murder. The courtroom remained quiet, but the meaning of those words was final. In 2019, the judge delivered the sentence: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Patrick Frazee would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the Berreth family, the verdict brought justice, but not closure, because one truth remained unresolved. The body of Kelsey Berreth has never been found. Somewhere in the vast landscape of Colorado, the final piece of this story is still missing. Investigators believe Patrick Frazee knows exactly where she is, but he has never revealed the location. Not during the investigation, not during the trial.
Not even after the conviction. And that silence may last forever. But the story of Kelsey Berreth did not end with her disappearance. It ended with the truth. A truth uncovered piece by piece, through patience, through evidence, and through the determination of people who refuse to let her simply vanish. Because sometimes justice arrives without every answer, but it still arrives. And in this case, it arrived for Kelsey. Why do you think he involved Crystal in?
Story, September 22nd, 2006. We're skipping our 4th hour. We're writing our plan right now for tonight. It's gonna be cool.
Just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a f***ing joke.
I'm shaking.
I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body.
Be no law against killing people.
Good evening and thanks for watching tonight. I'm Todd Blackington. In a split decision, the Idaho Supreme Court today threw out a conviction in an Eastern Idaho murder case that started 5 years ago this month.
September 22, 2006. Pocatello, Idaho. A quiet suburban street. Large houses. Wide yards. Very little traffic. The kind of place where nothing ever happens. That evening, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart arrived at a house on Whispering Cliffs Drive. She had been asked to watch the family pets while the owners were out of town. It was supposed to be simple. Feed the dogs, stay the night, leave in the morning. Nothing unusual. Cassie was a junior at Pocatello High School. Friends described her as kind, quiet, responsible. The kind of teenager parents trusted. That was why Allison and Frank Contreras asked her to house sit. The house itself was large, 2 floors, a finished basement, surrounded by dark hills and quiet streets. At night, the neighborhood became extremely quiet. Almost too quiet. Around 6 that evening, Cassie was not alone. Her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, came over to spend time with her. The plan was simple. Watch a movie, hang out for a while. Then Matt would go home. For a while, everything felt normal. They talked. They watched television. The dogs moved around the house. Then 2 more visitors arrived. Brian Draper, Tori Adamczyk. Classmates. Friends. They were both 16 years old. Cassie knew them well. They all went to the same high school. When they arrived, nothing seemed strange. Cassie greeted them at the door. She showed them around the house, including the basement. That detail would later become extremely important. But at that moment, it felt harmless. The 4 teenagers eventually gathered in the living room. They decided to watch a movie together. The film they chose was Kill Bill, Volume 2. The lights were dim. The television flickered. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, but the night had already started to change. At some point during the evening, Brian Draper quietly unlocked the basement door. He did it while no one was paying attention. No one noticed. Not Cassie, not Matt. That door would become the entrance. The 4 teenagers continued watching the movie for a while. Then, Brian and Tori stood up. They said they were leaving. According to them, they wanted to go to the movie theater. They said they were going to watch another film. Cassie believed them. Matt believed them. There was no reason not to. They left the house, or at least that's what it looked like. Outside, Draper and Adamczyk walked to their car. They drove away, but they didn't go far.
We're here in his car. The time is 9:50, September 22nd, 2006. Unfortunately, we have the grueling task of killing our 2 friends.
Instead, they parked down the street, out of sight. Then they waited. Inside the house, Cassie and Matt continued watching television. For a while, nothing seemed wrong. Then something strange happened. The lights flickered, just for a moment. Then the power went out. Complete darkness. Matt looked around the room. Cassie felt uneasy. In the basement, someone had flipped the circuit breaker. But Cassie and Matt didn't know that. The power came back a few moments later. The lights returned. The television turned back on, but something still felt wrong. One of the dogs started staring towards the basement stairs. The dog growled, soft at first, then louder. Matt noticed. He looked toward the hallway. The basement door sat at the end, closed, silent. Cassie was clearly uncomfortable. The strange power outage had shaken her. Matt tried to calm her down. Eventually, he called his mother. He asked if he could stay the night at Cassie's house, but she said no. Instead, she offered another option. Cassie could come stay at their house, then they would drive her back in the morning. It would have been safer, but Cassie refused. She had been trusted to watch the house, and she took that responsibility seriously. She decided to stay. Around 10:30 p.m., Matt's mother arrived. She picked him up outside the house. Cassie walked him to the door. Then she watched him leave. Matt later said he could still hear Cassie talking as he walked outside. She sounded normal. Nothing seemed wrong. A few minutes later, Matt called Tori Adamczyk. He wanted to know where they were. Maybe they could meet up later. The call connected, but something about the conversation was strange. Tori was whispering. Matt could barely hear him. Tori said they were at the movie theater. Matt believed him. But that wasn't true. Not even close. because while Matt was leaving the neighborhood, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were already back. They had changed clothes. Dark clothing, gloves, white masks. They moved quietly through the darkness. The basement door was still unlocked, exactly as they had planned. They slipped inside. Downstairs, hidden. Above them, Cassie sat alone in the living room. The television still flickered in the dark house. She had no idea. Not yet. But someone else was already inside, and they had been planning this night for weeks.
Weeks before that night, something had already started to change. At school, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk looked like ordinary teenagers. They laughed with friends, they went to class, they talked about movies. Nothing about them seemed dangerous, but that was only on the surface. Behind closed doors, they were recording something strange.
Hey, look, it's Cassie. Hey, look, hello, Cassie. I'm getting you on tape, okay? Say hi, please. Hi. Okay, see ya.
Home videos. The footage looked like a personal documentary. Two teenage boys sitting in a room, talking directly to the camera, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering. But the things they said were disturbing, very disturbing. Brian Draper was obsessed with horror movies, especially the slasher film Scream. He talked about it constantly. The idea of masked killers, the idea of creating fear. To him, it wasn't just entertainment, it was inspiration. But horror movies weren't the only thing that fascinated him. He was also obsessed with real violence. In particular, the 1999 school shooting known as the Columbine High School Massacre. The shooters involved in that attack had become symbols for him, not villains, heroes. In one piece of writing later shown in court, Draper admitted something disturbing. He said he wished he could go back in time. He said he wanted to stand beside Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Those words shocked investigators, but they also revealed something important. Brian Draper wanted recognition. He wanted to be remembered. Tori Adamczyk seemed quieter, but he shared the same fascination. Together, they began talking about doing something big, something that would make people notice them, something violent. At first, it sounded like fantasy, teenagers talking about dark ideas, but the conversations continued. Then they started recording their thoughts on camera. The videos looked almost casual, but the message was chilling. At one point, Draper looked directly into the lens. He talked about murder.
She's gonna die.
Not as a joke, not as fiction, but as a plan. He spoke calmly, almost excited. They talked about becoming famous. They talked about shocking the world. They talked about being remembered. In one recording, they even joked about becoming serial killers. But investigators later realized something important. These boys were not joking. They were planning, and they were already choosing targets. One of those targets was Matt Beckham, Cassie's boyfriend. They believed killing him first would create more fear. It would mirror the opening scene of the movie Scream. A couple, a dark house, a sudden attack. They imagined the scene like a movie. They wanted to recreate it. They wanted to become the villains. But there was another reason. Brian Draper had developed feelings for Cassie. At least, that's what several people later believed. He had reportedly asked her out. She had said no. Cassie was already dating Matt Beckham. For most teenagers, rejection would have been painful, but temporary. For Draper, it became something darker, something personal, something humiliating. He began talking about revenge. Not openly, but in hints, in jokes, in strange comments. At the same time, they were preparing.
They needed weapons, so they asked a friend for help, a teenager named Joe Lucero. He later testified in court. Lucero said he bought 4 knives for them. The money came from Draper and Adamczyk. $40 from Draper, $5 from Adamczyk. One of the knives had a serrated blade. Draper insisted on keeping that one. It would later become important evidence. But the most disturbing part was the excitement. They were thrilled. Their friends later said something strange. In school, Draper and Adamczyk often seemed quiet, withdrawn. But when they talked about their plans, they were energized, laughing, smiling, almost proud. At one point, they even started writing a death list, names of people they might kill, classmates, friends, people they knew. The list was real, but the opportunity had not appeared yet until September 22nd. Cassie Stoddart had been asked to house sit, a large house in a quiet neighborhood. Her relatives would be gone for the weekend.
She would be alone. When Draper and Adamczyk learned this, they immediately saw something. Opportunity. A large house, a dark basement, a quiet neighborhood, and one teenage girl inside. In one of their recordings, Tori Adamczyk described the situation. He spoke almost casually. She'll be alone in a big, dark house. To him, it sounded perfect. The plan began forming quickly. They would visit the house earlier that evening, pretend everything was normal. Then they would leave, return later, in disguise, enter through the basement, and begin the attack. Everything would feel like a horror movie. That was the point. But there was something even more disturbing.
Because natural selection, that's all I gotta say.
There should be no law against killing people.
They recorded themselves after leaving the house, sitting inside their car, laughing, talking about what they were about to do. Draper looked at the camera again, his voice calm, his face almost excited. He said something chilling. This is the night. And then they drove back toward the neighborhood.
The house on Whispering Cliffs Drive was quiet again. Inside, Cassie Stoddart sat alone in the living room. The television cast a soft glow across the walls. The dogs moved slowly around the house. Outside, the neighborhood had gone completely silent. Matt Beckham had been gone only a short time. Cassie had decided to stay. She had promised to watch the house, feed the dogs, lock the doors, sleep on the couch. Simple. But downstairs, something had already changed. In the basement, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk waited in the dark. They had entered quietly through the unlocked basement door, exactly as they had planned. They wore dark clothing, gloves, white masks, the kind often seen in horror movies. For a long time, they didn't move. They listened. Footsteps upstairs, the sound of the television, a dog walking across the floor. Cassie had no idea anyone was there. At first, the boys tried to lure her downstairs. They knocked over objects. They made small noises in the basement. They hoped Cassie would come down to investigate. That was part of the plan. But she never came. Instead, she stayed in the living room. So they tried something else. They walked to the circuit breaker panel and turned off the power again. The entire house went dark. Upstairs, Cassie froze. The lights had just gone out again. For a moment, the house felt different.
One of the dogs began barking toward the basement stairs, then growling. Cassie felt uneasy, but she still didn't go downstairs. After a few moments, the power came back on. Draper had switched the breaker back. They were trying to create fear, trying to make her curious, trying to make her come closer. But the plan wasn't working. Cassie stayed upstairs, on the couch, watching television, waiting for the night to pass.
Eventually, the boys realized something. If they wanted this to happen, they would have to go upstairs. They left the basement slowly, quiet steps, careful movements. The staircase creaked softly. They paused, listening. Cassie was still in the living room. She hadn't heard them. At the top of the stairs was a closet door. Draper grabbed the handle. He yanked it open, then slammed it shut. The sound exploded through the house. Cassie turned, her heart racing. Before she could understand what was happening, two masked figures rushed into the room. The attack happened quickly, too quickly. Cassie tried to fight back. She tried to escape, but the boys were armed. Draper held a dagger-style knife. Adamczyk carried a hunting knife. They attacked with shocking violence. Cassie was stabbed again and again, around 30 wounds in total. Investigators later determined that 12 of those injuries could have been fatal. The struggle lasted only moments. Then the house went quiet again. The television was still on. The dogs moved nervously around the room. Cassie lay on the floor. The attackers stepped back, breathing heavily, but something about the moment felt strange. They didn't panic. They didn't run immediately. Instead, they looked around the room, almost as if they were studying the scene, almost as if they were watching their own movie. Then they left the house, through the same basement door. The night outside felt cold and empty. They returned to their car and drove away. But the story didn't end there, not even close, because only minutes later, they turned the camera back on. Inside the car, the video recording continued. Brian Draper leaned toward the camera, his breathing fast, his voice excited. "We just killed Cassie." The words sounded unreal, almost unbelievable. Tori Adamczyk sat beside him. He laughed. The two teenagers talked about the attack, about the knives, about the house, about how no one knew yet. Draper smiled at the camera again. He spoke with disturbing confidence. No one will find out. They believed the plan had worked. They believed the house had hidden their secret. They believed the night would erase everything. But they had forgotten one thing: the camera. The house on Whispering Cliffs Drive stayed quiet for 2 days. No one entered. No one called the police. No one knew what had happened inside. Cassie Stoddart was still lying in the living room. The television had long gone silent. The house felt empty. But on Sunday evening, the owners of the house finally returned. Allison and Frank Contreras had been away for the weekend. They expected to come home to a normal house, quiet, clean, safe. Instead, they walked into something unimaginable. As soon as they stepped inside, something felt wrong. The house was too still, too quiet. They called out Cassie's name. No answer. They walked further into the living room, and then they saw her. Cassie Stoddart was lying on the floor. There was blood everywhere. For a moment, they couldn't understand what they were looking at. Then reality hit. They called 911 immediately. Police and paramedics rushed to the house, but it was already too late. Cassie had been dead for nearly 2 days. The scene was disturbing. Investigators quickly realized this was not an accident. This was murder. The house was sealed as a crime scene. Officers began documenting everything: the living room, the kitchen, the basement, the circuit breaker panel. The dogs were still inside the house, restless, agitated. Investigators began asking the most important question: who had been in the house that night? The answer came quickly. Cassie had not been alone. Her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, had been there earlier that evening. He became the first person investigators contacted, not because they believed he was guilty, but because he was the last person known to see her alive. Matt Beckham cooperated immediately.
He told detectives everything. About the movie, about the power going out, about the dogs barking at the basement. He explained that two friends had visited earlier, Brian Draper, Tori Adamczyk. Matt told investigators that the two boys had left to go to the movies. At least, that's what they had said. But something about their story quickly raised suspicion. Detectives began checking their alibi. They asked the boys what movie they had seen. Neither of them could explain the plot. They couldn't describe the scenes. They couldn't even explain the ending. It was a small detail, but it mattered. Investigators kept pushing. The boys changed their story. Suddenly, they said they had not gone to the theater after all.
I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a f***ing joke. I'm shaking. I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie. Oh, fuck. That felt like nothing real. I mean, it went by so fast.
Shut the fuck up. We gotta get our act straight.
Instead, they claimed they had driven around town, looking at cars. The story felt weak, and detectives noticed something else. The two teenagers seemed nervous, too nervous. Detectives decided to bring them in for further questioning. But there was still another mystery. During the crime scene investigation, detectives found fingerprints on the circuit breaker panel in the basement. That discovery raised immediate questions. Who had touched it? At first, investigators considered another person, Cassie's mother's boyfriend. His fingerprints matched. For a moment, he became a person of interest, but the explanation came quickly. He had previously done electrical work in the house months earlier. The homeowners confirmed it. That lead disappeared, which brought the investigation back to two names: Brian Draper, Tori Adamczyk. Both had been in the house. Both had left that night. Both had weak stories. Detectives began preparing for formal interrogations, but they didn't yet know something critical, something hidden in a canyon outside town. Because after the murder, Draper and Adamczyk had tried to destroy evidence. They drove to a remote area called Black Rock Canyon. There, they burned clothing, masks, and other items used that night. They believed the fire would erase everything, but they missed something: a partially burned VHS tape. That tape would later become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the entire case, because it contained the truth, their plan, their excitement, their confession. But investigators had not found it yet. At that moment, the detectives in Pocatello were still piecing together the timeline, still trying to understand the night Cassie Stoddart died. They didn't know it yet, but the killers had already documented their own crime on camera. By September 27th, the investigation had narrowed. Detectives in Pocatello had already spoken to dozens of people: friends, classmates, neighbors. The timeline of the night was becoming clearer. Cassie Stoddart had last been seen alive with three people: Matt Beckham, Brian Draper, and Tori Adamczyk. Matt's story remained consistent. He had been picked up by his mother around 10:30 p.m. Phone records confirmed it. His mother confirmed it. His alibi held. That left two names: Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. Detectives invited them to the police station. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Two teenage boys sitting across from investigators, trying to look calm. But something about their behavior felt strange. They were nervous, very nervous. Detectives began with simple questions. Where were you Friday night? Both boys gave the same answer. They had gone to the movies. They said they watched a horror film called Pulse. The problem was simple. Detectives asked them to describe the movie, the plot, the characters, the ending. Neither of them could do it, not convincingly. The answers were vague, uncertain, almost rehearsed. Detectives noticed immediately. The story didn't make sense, so they pressed harder. Eventually, the story changed. Suddenly, the boys admitted something different. They said they had not actually gone to the theater. Instead, they claimed they had been driving around, looking at cars. The explanation sounded weak, but detectives were already noticing something else. Brian Draper looked increasingly uncomfortable. His hands shook slightly. His eyes avoided the detectives. At one point, he asked to speak privately, just him, no one else. Detectives agreed. The room became quiet. Draper took a deep breath. Then he began talking. At first, he tried to minimize his role. He blamed Tori Adamczyk. He said Adamczyk had planned everything. He claimed Adamczyk had pushed him to participate. But as the interview continued, the truth started to surface, slowly, piece by piece. Draper admitted they had returned to the house. He admitted they had worn masks. He admitted they had entered through the basement. And finally, he admitted the attack. But even then, he tried to shift responsibility. He said Adamczyk had ordered him to make sure Cassie was dead. According to Draper, Adamczyk told him, "Make sure she's dead." The confession changed everything. Police immediately arrested both boys. They were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder.
But Draper had also revealed something else, something investigators hadn't known yet. He told detectives about Black Rock Canyon, a remote area outside the city. That was where they had gone after the attack, to destroy evidence. Detectives quickly organized a search. They drove to the canyon. The area was rough and isolated. Dusty ground, sharp rocks, deep shadows. At first, the search revealed burned clothing, charred fabric, melted plastic, fragments of gloves, pieces of masks. But then investigators found something unexpected, partially buried in the dirt, a damaged VHS tape. It had been burned, but not completely destroyed. Investigators carefully collected it. The tape was sent to a forensic lab. Technicians worked to restore the recording. It wasn't easy. The fire had damaged much of the recording, but eventually they recovered something: video. And what they saw was chilling. The tape showed Draper and Adamczyk before the murder, talking, laughing, discussing their plan. In one clip, Draper looked directly into the camera. He said they were going to become famous. In another clip, they talked about their targets: Cassie Stoddart, Matt Beckham, and possibly others.
Then came the most disturbing footage. The recording made inside their car, just minutes after the murder. The two boys looked excited, adrenaline still in their voices. Draper leaned toward the camera. He spoke clearly. "We just killed Cassie." The detectives watching the footage were stunned. The killers had recorded their own confession without realizing it. The tape removed any doubt. This was not a spontaneous crime. It had been planned, filmed, and celebrated. The case was now undeniable. Two 16-year-old boys had carefully planned the murder of their classmate and documented the entire process on camera.
The arrests of Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk shocked the city of Pocatello. Two 16-year-old boys, honor students, film enthusiasts, now accused of planning and committing a brutal murder. For many people, the question was impossible to answer. How could two teenagers do something like this? The case moved quickly through the legal system. The charges were severe: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, because the crime had been planned, recorded, and carried out with extreme violence. Prosecutors prepared a powerful case. They had physical evidence: knives, burned clothing, recovered items from Black Rock Canyon. But the most devastating evidence was the video.
the recordings made by the killers themselves. The jury would eventually see those tapes, and once they did, the story became undeniable. Before the trial began, the defense teams tried different strategies. Brian Draper's lawyers attempted to portray him as manipulated, a follower, someone influenced by Tori Adamczyk. They argued that Draper had not been the mastermind, but the evidence told a different story. In the recordings, Draper often appeared excited, confident, even proud of what they planned. Tori Adamczyk's defense took another path. His lawyers suggested that the videos were part of a fictional horror project, a film. They claimed the boys had only been pretending, that the violence had not been meant to happen. But the prosecution dismantled that argument quickly. The attack had been real. The evidence was real. And Cassie Stoddart was dead.
When the trial finally began in 2007, the courtroom was packed. Family members sat in silence. Friends from school filled the benches. Journalists waited quietly. Everyone wanted answers. One of the most emotional moments came when Cassie's family entered the courtroom. Her parents, her relatives, people who had watched her grow up, now forced to hear the details of her final night. The prosecution carefully presented the timeline. They explained how the boys had planned the murder, how they had unlocked the basement door, how they had returned wearing masks, how they had attacked Cassie. Then the jury saw the videos, the recordings from before the murder, the killers smiling, laughing, talking about becoming famous, talking about killing their classmates. Some people in the courtroom looked away, others stared in disbelief. But the most disturbing footage came next, the recording made after the murder. Inside the car, Brian Draper leaned toward the camera. "We just killed Cassie." The words echoed through the courtroom. No one moved, no one spoke. The jury watched the tape in silence. The defense teams tried to challenge the evidence. They questioned the interpretation of the videos. They tried to argue about influence, about teenage immaturity. But the recordings were too clear, too direct, too disturbing. One additional piece of evidence shocked the jury even further. A written document created by Brian Draper, a text titled Columbine. In it, Draper wrote about his admiration for the shooters behind the Columbine High School massacre. He described them as heroes. He wrote that he wished he could stand beside them. The document revealed something disturbing. This was not a moment of anger, not a sudden mistake. It was fascination, violence as identity, violence as ambition. For the prosecution, the motive became clear: fame, attention, recognition. Two teenagers trying to create their own place in history, even if it meant destroying a life. The jury did not deliberate for long. On April 17, 2007, Brian Draper was found guilty of first-degree murder. Later that same year, on June 8th, Tori Adamczyk received the same verdict. Both teenagers had been convicted, but the sentencing phase still remained, and it would determine how the rest of their lives would unfold. By the summer of 2007, the case had already changed the city of Pocatello. The trial had revealed everything: the planning, the videos, the obsession with violence. For the community, the shock had not faded. Many people were still asking the same question: why? Why would two teenagers murder their own classmate? The sentencing hearings would not answer that question, but they would decide the future of the two boys responsible. Brian Draper appeared in court first. The courtroom felt tense. Cassie Stoddart's family sat together. Friends from school watched quietly. The prosecution spoke clearly. They reminded the court that this was not an impulsive act. This was not a sudden fight. This was planning, weeks of preparation, a deliberate attack. They spoke about the videos, the excitement in the killer's voices, the moment Draper looked at the camera and talked about becoming famous. The prosecution argued that the crime showed extreme disregard for human life. They asked the court to impose the strongest possible sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The defense tried to argue for something different. Brian Draper was only 16 years old, still a minor. His lawyers asked the court to consider the possibility of rehabilitation. They argued that teenagers sometimes make catastrophic decisions, that Draper could change. But the judge had to consider the nature of the crime, the planning, the brutality, the complete lack of remorse visible in the recordings. In April 2007, Brian Draper was formally sentenced, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentence meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Just weeks later, Torrey Adamczyk returned to the same courtroom. His sentencing hearing carried the same tension. The evidence against him had been just as strong. The videos showed him participating in the planning, laughing, discussing the attack. The prosecution argued that Adamczyk had played an equal role. He had not tried to stop the crime. He had helped plan it. He had carried a weapon. He had participated in the murder. The defense again focused on his age, 16 years old. Too young, they argued, to be sentenced to die in prison. But the judge reached the same conclusion. The crime had been deliberate, calculated, and devastating. Torrey Adamczyk received the same sentence, life in prison, without parole. In addition, both boys received an additional sentence for conspiracy, 30 years to life. For Cassie's family, the verdict brought a complicated sense of closure. Nothing could bring her back. Nothing could erase the horror of that night. But the people responsible would never walk free again. Brian Draper and Torrey Adamczyk were transferred to the Idaho State Correctional Institution, a large prison complex located near Kuna, Idaho. There they would begin their life sentences, far from the quiet streets of Pocatello, far from the house on Whispering Cliffs Drive. But the legal story did not end there. Over the years that followed, both men attempted to challenge their convictions. Appeals were filed. Arguments were presented. Lawyers tried to reopen parts of the case. They argued about sentencing laws, about the rights of juvenile offenders. But again and again, the courts reached the same conclusion. The convictions remained. The life sentences remained. For the legal system, the case was closed. But for the people who knew Cassie Stoddart, the story would never truly end. After the trial ended, the city of Pocatello tried to return to normal. But normal was different now. The murder of Cassie Stoddart had changed the community. Students returned to school. Teachers returned to classrooms. But the memory of what happened that night stayed with them. For many students at Pocatello High School, the realization was difficult to accept. The killers had not been strangers. They had not been outsiders. They had been classmates, people who sat in the same hallways, people who shared the same classrooms, people who seemed ordinary. That truth made the crime even harder to understand. The house on Whispering Cliffs Drive eventually became quiet again. The crime scene tape disappeared. The police cars were gone. But for those who knew what happened there, the house would never feel the same. For Cassie's family, the loss was permanent. On October 1st, 2006, hundreds of people gathered for her funeral. Friends, teachers, neighbors. More than 500 people came to say goodbye. The grief was overwhelming. Cassie was 16 years old. She had her entire life ahead of her. Plans, dreams, a future that would never happen. But her family refused to let her memory disappear. In the years that followed, they created something in her honor, an event known as Pumpkins for Cassie. Each year, members of the community helped grow pumpkins. People who donated food to local charities or animal shelters received one. It was a small act of kindness, a way to remember Cassie, a way to turn tragedy into something positive. Meanwhile, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk began their life inside prison walls. Both men were sent to the Idaho State Correctional Institution, a large prison complex in Idaho. There, they would spend the rest of their lives. Years later, both men attempted to challenge their sentences. Their lawyers filed appeals. They argued that juvenile offenders should have a chance at parole. They asked the courts to reconsider the life sentences. But each time, the courts rejected the requests. The rulings remained the same: life in prison without parole. For the legal system, the case had reached its conclusion. But for many people, the story remained unsettling, because the questions still lingered. 2 teenagers, a quiet town, a normal night, and a crime that felt like a horror movie. Except it wasn't fiction, it was real. Cassie Stoddart's story became one of the most disturbing true crime cases in Idaho history, not only because of the violence, but because of the planning, the cameras, the desire for fame. 2 boys who wanted to create their own horror story, and a girl who trusted them as friends. In your opinion, should teenagers who commit crimes like this ever be given a second chance?
January 27, 2020. An 11-year-old boy disappears. No witnesses, no clear explanation. Just one person who claims to know what happened: his stepmother. But within hours, investigators begin to notice something strange. Her story keeps changing. And then police discover surveillance footage from a neighbor's house. It shows a truck leaving the driveway. Inside that truck is Gannon. But when the vehicle returns, he's gone. What happened inside that house would become one of the most disturbing child murder cases in Colorado history. And the person responsible was someone Gannon trusted. The video begins in a quiet room. The camera is pointed toward the floor. In the background, a young boy can be heard crying.
Well, devastating. Initially, Scott, I can't lie, when the TMZ information...
Gannon, I promise it's the last time I'm going to ask you. I'm just freaked out, okay? Are you sure you didn't do it on purpose? Okay, we promise. You promise.
His voice is shaky. At one point, he says, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do it." The boy in the recording is 11-year-old Gannon Stauch. The person holding the phone is his stepmother, Letitia Stauch. The video was recorded inside their home in Colorado Springs. Investigators would later determine that the video was recorded on the night of January 26, 2020, only hours before Gannon disappeared. In the recording, Gannon sounds scared. He repeatedly apologizes. At one point, he says he didn't mean to damage the carpet. Letitia can be heard speaking to him. The conversation centers around what she describes as a candle accident. According to her later explanation, Gannon had knocked over a candle. The candle had fallen onto the carpet in the basement area of the house. The flame briefly burned part of the carpet. At the time, the situation was described as a small household accident, but investigators would later question that explanation, because something about the video felt unsettling. Gannon didn't sound like a child who had simply spilled a candle. He sounded terrified, and the recording raised another question. Why was he repeatedly apologizing so much? To understand what was happening inside that house that night, investigators began looking more closely at the family itself. Gannon lived with his father, Al Stauch, his stepmother, Letitia, and his younger sister. His father served in the United States Army National Guard. At the time of Gannon's disappearance, Al was away from home on military duty in Oklahoma. That meant Letitia was the only adult in the house. Gannon's younger sister was also home that night, but according to investigators, she was asleep in her room during much of the evening. People who knew Gannon described him as a quiet, thoughtful kid. He loved video games. He enjoyed science and technology. Teachers at his school said he was polite and respectful. Friends remembered him as the kind of kid who rarely caused trouble, which made the tone of the video even more disturbing. Because in the recording, Gannon sounded like he believed he had done something terribly wrong. Later that night, Letitia sent a message to Al. The timestamp on the message read 2:48 a.m. In the message, she said Gannon was still upset about the candle incident. She also wrote that he was in the bathroom and that there was blood. At the time, the message didn't make much sense. Blood from where? Investigators would later ask the same question, because forensic evidence would eventually show that Gannon had suffered serious injuries inside the house. But on the night of January 26th, no one outside that home knew any of this. To neighbors, the house looked quiet. Nothing appeared unusual. But sometime during that night, prosecutors would later argue the situation inside that home escalated into violence. Violence that left an 11-year-old boy dead, and by the next morning, Gannon Stauch would be gone.
Morning came quietly on Monday, January 27, 2020. Inside the home in Colorado Springs, the night from the day before had already left questions that no one yet understood. According to Letitia Stauch, Gannon had not gone to school that morning. She later told investigators that he had complained about stomach pain, so he stayed home. At that moment, nothing about that decision seemed unusual. Kids miss school sometimes. But investigators would later realize that the events of that morning would become the final confirmed timeline of Gannon Stauch. Inside the house, only 3 people were present: Letitia, Gannon, and Gannon's younger sister. According to investigators, the younger sister was largely unaware of what was happening. She was in another room during most of the morning, and at that time there were no witnesses to what was happening inside the home. But investigators would later find something that changed everything: a security camera belonging to a neighbor across the street. The camera captured the Stauch driveway. At 10:13 a.m., the camera recorded a red pickup truck leaving the driveway. Behind the wheel was Letitia. Investigators believed Gannon was inside the vehicle with her. The truck drove away from the house. At first glance, the video looked completely ordinary: a car leaving a suburban driveway, nothing more. But the video would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because hours later, the same camera recorded the truck returning. The timestamp read 2:19 p.m. The video shows Letitia getting out of the vehicle, but Gannon is never seen getting out of the truck. Investigators would later review that footage again and again, frame by frame, trying to determine whether the camera might have missed something. But there was no sign of Gannon leaving the vehicle. This created a major contradiction in Letitia's story, because later that evening, she told investigators that she had seen Gannon much later in the day. According to her version of events, she claimed that she had dropped him off near a friend's house. But the timeline from the camera raised serious doubts about that claim. As the afternoon passed, the situation became more confusing. Gannon never came home. Family members began asking questions. Neighbors began noticing that something was wrong. Then, in the evening, Letitia made the call that would start the official investigation. Around 7 p.m., she reported Gannon missing. During the call to emergency services, the dispatcher asked several routine questions.
We counted over 20-some death threats already. 2, my husband's ex-wife is living in our home.
One of them was simple: who was the last person
not
to
make
see
these false
Gannon?
accusations.
When last
Letitia
seen,
answered,
Gannon was
"I
wearing
guess
a blue...
me." At that moment, police believed they were responding to a missing child case. Officers arrived at the home. Search teams began organizing. Neighbors volunteered to help look for the boy.
We want to just come together and do something to support Gannon and his family.
Police checked nearby parks, trails, and open land. Everyone hoped the situation would have a simple explanation. Maybe Gannon had wandered away. Maybe he had gone to a friend's house. But detectives were already noticing something that didn't feel right. As they spoke with Letitia, small inconsistencies began appearing in her story. Details shifted. Timelines changed. And the more investigators listened, the more questions they began to ask. Because the events of that day were starting to suggest something much darker.
In the days following the disappearance of Gannon Stauch, the search across Colorado Springs continued to grow. Search teams moved through parks, wooded trails, and open fields. Volunteers walked miles of terrain. Police officers knocked on doors asking neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. Helicopters scanned the surrounding area. At that point, everyone was still hoping for a miracle. But inside the investigation, detectives were beginning to notice something troubling. The story given by Letitia Stauch was beginning to change. When investigators first spoke with her on the evening of January 27th, her explanation sounded relatively simple. She said she had last seen Gannon that afternoon. According to her version of events, she claimed that she had dropped him off near a friend's house. From there, she said, he never returned. But as detectives began reconstructing the timeline, new questions appeared. The security camera footage from the neighbor contradicted key parts of her story. The camera showed Letitia leaving the house at 10:13 a.m. and returning at 2:19 p.m. But there was no footage showing Gannon leaving the house afterward. When detectives asked follow-up questions, the story began to shift. In another version, Letitia suggested that Gannon might have run away. She told investigators he had been upset the night before. She implied that he might have left the house on his own. But that explanation also raised doubts. Investigators found no evidence that Gannon had packed anything. He had not taken his phone. He had not taken clothes. He had not taken money. Nothing suggested that an 11-year-old boy had planned to run away. Then the story changed again. At one point, during interviews with investigators, Letitia introduced a completely different explanation. She claimed that she had been attacked by a man. According to her story, the man spoke Spanish. She said the man had assaulted her inside the house and kidnapped Gannon. Investigators immediately began looking into the claim. But the details quickly began falling apart. Letitia could not provide a clear description of the alleged attacker. She also refused a medical examination that could have confirmed whether the assault had actually occurred. Without evidence, the story quickly lost credibility. Meanwhile, detectives continued examining the physical evidence inside the house, and what they were finding was beginning to suggest something much darker. But while the investigation was unfolding behind the scenes, something else was happening in public. Letitia began speaking with the media. In one widely circulated interview, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Gannon's disappearance. She said she felt like people were already accusing her. At times, she appeared defensive. At other moments, emotional. But many viewers who watched the interview noticed something strange. Instead of focusing on finding Gannon, Letitia often focused on defending herself. For investigators, the growing inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Because every new version of the story created more questions. And by this point, detectives were already building a different theory. One that no one wanted to believe at first. Because the evidence inside the home suggested that the disappearance of Gannon Stauch might not be a missing person case at all. By the end of January 2020, investigators working the disappearance of Gannon Stauch were beginning to focus their attention on a single location, the Stauch home in Colorado Springs. At first, the house had simply been the last known place where Gannon had been seen. But as detectives reviewed the timeline and examined the evidence, it became increasingly clear that something serious had happened inside those walls. Forensic teams began a detailed examination of the home. Their primary focus quickly became Gannon's bedroom. Inside that room, investigators carefully documented every surface: the mattress, the carpet, the walls, the baseboards, and almost immediately they began finding blood. Blood was located on the mattress where Gannon slept. Additional stains were found on the carpet beside the bed. When investigators lifted the carpet, they discovered blood beneath it as well. More stains were found along the baseboards and on the wall near an electrical outlet. The amount of blood present in the room immediately raised serious concerns. According to forensic experts, the volume of blood suggested that a violent injury had occurred in that space. This was not consistent with a minor accident. It suggested something far more severe. Investigators also noticed something else. There were clear signs that someone had attempted to clean the room. Parts of the carpet appeared to have been treated with cleaning products. Certain areas of the floor had been scrubbed. Some stains had been partially removed. But despite the effort, forensic testing still revealed the presence of blood. While detectives were processing the house, they uncovered another important detail. On the evening of January 27th, Letitia Stauch had sent a message asking her daughter to purchase several items from a store. Those items included carpet cleaner, trash bags, and baking soda. Investigators later recovered the receipt. The purchase had been made shortly after 6 p.m. Prosecutors would later argue that these items were used to clean the crime scene. At this point, the investigation had taken a dramatic turn. Detectives were no longer asking where Gannon had gone. They were asking what had happened to him. Before we continue with the investigation, take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy detailed true crime investigations like this one, consider subscribing. And if you want to see more stories where we break down real cases step by step, leave a like on the video. Now, let's continue, because investigators would soon uncover evidence that revealed the brutality of the attack. When medical examiners later analyzed Gannon's remains, the extent of the violence became clear. The 11-year-old boy had suffered multiple forms of injury. There were 18 stab wounds. There were also blunt force injuries, suggesting he had been struck with a heavy object. And finally, investigators discovered a gunshot wound. Some of the injuries showed signs that Gannon had attempted to defend himself. For investigators, the evidence pointed to a brutal and prolonged attack. Prosecutors would later argue that the attack had taken place inside that house, and that afterward, someone had attempted to hide what had happened. But one major question still remained. If Gannon had been killed inside that house, where had the body been taken? By early March 2020, investigators working the case of Gannon Stauch believed they already understood what had happened inside the Stauch home. The forensic evidence, the timeline, the contradictions in the statements of Letitia Stauch, all of it pointed in the same direction. But one crucial piece of the case was still missing. Gannon's body had not yet been found. Even without that discovery, prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to move forward. On March 2, 2020, Letitia Stauch was arrested in South Carolina. Authorities took her into custody and charged her with multiple crimes, including first-degree murder. At that moment, the investigation had already shifted from a missing person case to a homicide. But investigators still continued searching. Then, about 2 weeks later, a discovery was made hundreds of miles away. In mid-March 2020, human remains were found inside a suitcase beneath a bridge near Pace. The location was nearly 1,300 miles away from Gannon's home in Colorado. Authorities soon confirmed the identity of the remains.
Stepmother.
You've been a part of the investigation since the very first time. You were the last person to see him. Is that right?
Correct.
What did you see when you last saw him?
Well, I'm not allowed to talk about anything with the case. I would more so be willing to talk about how the community needs to have faith and continue to work together and not make these false accusations.
They belonged to Gannon Stauch. The discovery revealed something investigators had long suspected. Gannon's body had been transported across multiple states. During the trial, prosecutors would later explain that the body had likely been moved several times before eventually being abandoned in Florida. When medical examiners conducted the autopsy, they revealed the full extent of the violence. Gannon had suffered 18 stab wounds. He had also been struck with a blunt object. And finally, he had suffered a gunshot wound. Some of the injuries suggested that he had tried to defend himself. For investigators, the evidence pointed to an extremely violent attack. But the most dramatic stage of the case was still ahead: the trial. The trial of Letitia Stauch began in 2023 in Colorado.
January 26th is at 11:30 p.m. What is that?
So it takes Harley approximately 20 minutes to get home. Harley's now home when this message from the defendant goes to Mr. Stauch. It's 11:30 p.m. Sunday night, and it reads, Gannon was on the toilet most of the night upstairs and downstairs. He had a candle on earlier tonight because he said he kept smelling poop from his accidents in his pants. That's what he told us afterwards.
Course of several weeks, prosecutors presented a detailed reconstruction of what they believed had happened. They showed the jury the forensic evidence from Gannon's bedroom. They explained the blood patterns. They presented the timeline from the neighbor's security camera. They also described the purchases of cleaning supplies made shortly after Gannon disappeared. Prosecutors argued that Letitia had attempted to clean the crime scene and hide the body. The defense did not deny that Letitia had caused Gannon's death. Instead, they focused on a different argument. They claimed she had been legally insane at the time of the crime. Psychiatric experts testified during the trial, but prosecutors argued that Letitia's actions after the killing showed planning and awareness. Moving the body, cleaning the room, changing her story repeatedly. According to prosecutors, these actions demonstrated that she understood what she had done. After weeks of testimony, the case was given to the jury. The decision came in May 2023. The jury found Letitia Stauch guilty of multiple charges, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Gannon's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but it could never undo the loss of a young boy. A boy who had trusted the people around him, and whose life ended in a crime that shocked an entire community. In the end, the case of Gannon Stauch left behind more than just a criminal conviction. It left a community searching for answers. Teachers remembered a quiet boy who enjoyed science and video games. Neighbors remembered seeing him ride his bike around the neighborhood. Friends remembered a kid who tried to make people laugh. But behind the closed doors of the home where he lived, something was already going terribly wrong. A conflict, an argument, a moment of violence, and within hours, an 11-year-old boy was gone. The investigation that followed would stretch across multiple states, from Colorado to Florida. Detectives, forensic experts, and prosecutors would spend years piecing together the truth. And in the end, a jury decided that the person responsible was the one person who was supposed to protect him, Letitia Stauch. Today, she will spend the rest of her life in prison. But the story of Gannon Stauch is not just about the crime. It is also about a child whose life ended far too soon, and a reminder of how quickly trust can be broken.
Before we end this video, there is one question many people still ask when they hear this story. What really happened inside that house that night? Do you believe the attack was planned, or do you think the situation spiraled out of control in a moment of anger? Let me know what you think in the comments below.
Thank you to everyone who watched the video all the way to the end. Our team put a lot of effort into creating it. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. It's a huge motivation for us to work even harder and release new videos faster.